Hi y'all, my name is Cynthia Payne and I am the self-published author of The Last Dragon Princess. Today is part 3 in our 5-part series about the basics of book marketing as a self-published author. Today is all about book covers, what they're supposed to do, what they're not supposed to do, how to avoid common pitfalls, all that. So let's get into it. One thing that self-published books are unfortunately known for are their book covers. Part of this is because self-published books tend to have minimal budgets, but that's not all that's going on. The larger part of why you see so many terrible book covers in the self-publishing industry is because the authors themselves don't understand what a book cover is supposed to do for them, and they don't understand how to either go about instructing their designer on how to make an appropriate book cover, or they themselves just don't have the knowledge to create something that is going to be effective for them. Now, for those of you who have not watched the intro video, we are treating book marketing as a badly illustrated table. Each of the 4 legs of the table represent one of the 4 key factors of basic book marketing. All 4 legs must be present and holding their own weight before more advanced marketing techniques can be placed on top of that table, lest they all fall off and become useless to you. So the main thing to keep in mind when you're designing your book cover or you're thinking about what your book cover should look like is you need to understand that the book cover is not the book. The book cover has nothing to do with the book. The book cover is about marketing. The book cover is there to sell your book. It is not a part of your book. So you need to make that mental shift from a book cover being something you're emotionally invested in and something you want to like and something you want to be unique to your book and to you, and shift that over into the book cover is a tool that you're going to use to sell your book. Because that's all that a book cover is, and that's all that it should be. It is a tool to help the right kind of readers find your book. With that in mind, we also have to face the very real reality that as a self-published author, you're probably not going to be in actual bookstores. You're looking at online sales. And when people are looking for books online, they're scrolling through thumbnails. Your book gets about a half a second to communicate everything that the reader needs to know in order to pique their interest enough to click on that thumbnail. You get a half a second to attract exactly the right kind of reader who is looking for exactly your kind of book. That's all you get. No arguments, no excuses. By the time you've said, but my book can't be judged yet, no, they've already scrolled past that. Half second's done, you had your chance, it's gone now. So a half second isn't much. What do we need to communicate in that half second to this reader who we've never met and doesn't know us and doesn't know our book? We need to communicate the genre, and we need to communicate the setting. These 2 things, the reader already knows what they're looking for. They might not know the title of the book or any of the specifics, but they know they're in the mood to read this sort of genre with this sort of setting. They know what they're looking for. They've already typed in those keywords, and your book has shown up in those keywords. You need to show them further that your book matches exactly what they want. What you absolutely do not want to do in this half second is to have any level of confusion in your potential readers about what your genre is or what your setting is. Too many times, the most common pitfalls that self-published authors have when designing their cover is they're trying to put too much in there. They're trying to cram a lot of information. It gets very busy, it gets very confusing, and they fail to communicate these 2 critical elements that readers are actually looking for. So how do you do this? Basically, you want to go against every instinct you have, and you want to design a cover or pick a cover that fits in with all the books similar to yours in your genre. Now, you don't want to do this because your book is unique, your book is special, and your book deserves a cover just as unique and special as your book. And again, I'm going to tell you, your cover is not your book. Your cover is a tool. You see? You see where we're going with this? So before you even start conceptualizing the cover of your book, you need to do some research. You need to spend some time on Amazon. You need to spend some time on Barnes & Noble, although Amazon's perfectly fine, truth be told. And you need to be researching books in your genre with your setting. So if you're writing a historical fiction about Vikings, you need to put those keywords in your search. Now, the last video in this series, we talked about keywords. You need to be typing in those keywords, and you need to be looking at the sort of covers that are popping up that are going to be similar to your book. If you wrote a fairy tale retelling, you need to look at book covers of other fairy tale retellings. You also need to be looking at how well those covers are selling those books. So you need to be looking at the sales rankings of these books and seeing where in the Amazon paid ranking it falls. Specifically, you're looking for that number to be 10,000 or lower. That's a very well-selling book, and that means its cover is working for it. In less mainstream genres, like maybe you're writing a poetry collection or a short story collection, or you're in like a steampunk genre or something that doesn't have as much of a following and probably isn't going to get in that 10,000 ranking, then you just sort of want to compare everything on the first and second page and see what books are selling better than others, and just do a sort of compare and contrast, see if you can figure out which covers are doing better. What you are looking for when you're looking at those covers. You want to be looking at white space or empty space. You want to be looking at the fonts used, and you want to be looking at the imagery. So what sorts of images are being used, how they're being used. But definitely spend a day, spend a couple days, spend a couple weeks if you want to, getting a very clear idea of your specific genre's book cover standards. You want your book cover to meet the standards for your genre. You want to make that half-second count. The worst thing you can do for your book that you put all that work and effort into making is to create a book cover that's going to appeal to readers who aren't interested in your sort of book. A book cover that maybe it looks fantastic, but it doesn't meet the standards of your genre. It meets the standards of a different genre, and therefore it's not going to attract the readers that would enjoy your book. That's kind of a nightmare scenario, because these readers are going to do nothing but leave bad reviews on your book because it wasn't marketed correctly. You also want your book cover to look pretty clean and utilize the negative space. So what this means is not being too busy, not cramming too much in there, and paying attention to what your genre standard is for the negative space or the stuff that's not there. Some genres, like poetry collections, have a lot of negative space. This pretty much the entire cover is blank, or there's just a simple design. It reads as negative space. It's something that's not there. Other genres, like YA fantasy, have very little negative space, and there's a lot going on in these covers, and they're very dynamic. Some genres lend themselves very well to simple book covers that are easy to DIY, even for someone like myself that does not have any level of graphics design ability. But some book covers, again, YA fantasy, have a very high standard for illustration or for graphics. And if you're writing in this genre, you really want to either purchase a pre-made book cover or have one designed. There's a lot of pre-made book covers out there that are not very expensive, and even a $20 one that you get on Etsy or Fiverr or something is going to be more effective than something that you DIY, unless you are, of course, a professional graphics designer or have a lot of experience in graphics design. Then you might be able to do something on your own, come up with a good imagery. But for just your average Joe who wrote a book, if you're in a genre where you can DIY it, good job, you got lucky. If you're not in a genre where the genre standard lends itself well to simple book covers that you can do on your own, then you wanna save up some money, you wanna put it aside and invest at least a minimal amount into that book cover. Okay, next, minimal color spectrums. Now what this means is this is what's going to make your book cover pop. You've got a pretty small canvas to work on. A book cover, and specifically the thumbnail of that book cover, which is what people are actually going to see, there's not a lot of space there, and you need something that's going to have the right effect. So you don't want to put too much information onto that small image. You want it more clean than fancy. Working with just a few colors rather than trying to shove the whole rainbow into there is usually going to have a better result. It's better to do simple well than to do fancy half-assed. So a bad book cover is by definition a book cover that is not holding its own weight on that table. It's a book cover that is not going to sell your book or is going to sell your book to the wrong readers. So we've already talked about why a bad cover is one that stands out or is unique. You don't need your book cover to be unique, you need your book to be unique. And it's already unique because you wrote it. So you really need to get your mind wrapped around the idea that your book cover is not your book, it's a tool. And having that tool stand out is probably not going to be a good thing when all you've got is that half second. And let me show you a really good example of what I mean by this. Now I'm going to block out the title. You may not have read this book, but there was a movie made out of it, and I can just about guarantee that you have watched that movie. You've probably watched this movie many, many, many times, and I would challenge you to see if you can figure out what this story is about, or what this genre is. So my initial impression of this is that and I'm gonna block out some other things because this is YouTube, but yeah, it has to me sort of an Egyptian horror theme going on. The woman's face, she looks, her headdress and everything, her collar here, it looks very Egyptian. She's got that bird thing going on. There's a lot of skulls. That normally means, death and horror, because there are snakes coming out of somewhere I probably don't want to mention out loud on YouTube. There's clearly some death metaphors going on here. This cover is a mess. And yeah, my impression is that it would be an Egyptian horror. I would challenge you to, come up with your own ideas. It's also a story that you're very familiar with. This is the original cover for William Goldman's The Princess Bride. Yeah, that Princess Bride. Yeah, this cover makes no sense in the context of the genre and the setting. The timeline is wrong. The genre is wrong. And there's probably a very good reason why this book didn't sell too well and that no one had heard of the story until an abridged version was released. So where this book went wrong, there's a lot going on here. If you've read the book, you know that the snakes are significant. If you're familiar with the story, you know that there is some flaying that happens or some torture that happens in the story. But none of this really communicates that. This is the sort of cover I see again and again when it's designed by the author. So much is basically the author is trying to give a glimpse of the plot in the cover. And that's not the cover's job. The cover's job is to attract the right kind of readers for your book. So let's look at a much simpler book cover, something that actually would not be too difficult to do with some very basic and free software. And it should be pretty apparent already what this book is. The setting is very clear. We're in a city. That is communicated very clearly with this skyline, even though that is the simplest possible skyline you can have. It's literally an outline of some boxes with a solid color. The colors are very bright and kind of flirty, and that's going to communicate more of a comedy vibe. The script is a combination of super frilly, this script, and very bold. So that right there communicates contemporary romance. And then you've got just this very simple outline. This is probably just a stock image that someone did a very good job of removing the background of, and we're going to talk about that. And then just put it over this skyline and added the text. And that's it. There are like 2 images. One is simply, it's a high resolution image that has been very well, the background removed and very well, very professionally put on there. There's no shadows here that need to be messed with, so that's easy. This is an exceptionally simple book cover. It's also an exceptionally effective book cover. This clearly places this book in the contemporary romance comedy. This is probably a contemporary rom-com. And this book very clearly communicates that. Another very simple book cover. Okay, this is a single image. This is a high resolution image. Okay, the font is very scripty. So this is probably a romance. The title indicates it's probably also a mystery of some sort. It communicates the setting very clearly just from the woman's outfit here and her hairstyle. This is very, I don't know my history well, but this is like a very 1950s sort of, that's what I think. There's an era that's there, and I might have the wrong decade, but I'm close. But that's, my bad, not the book cover's bad. Her outfit, her hair, the silhouette, it's very iconic. So we have the setting, we have the genre. This is a mystery romance. Again, very, very, very simple. You could do this book cover on your own very easily using a single stock image and the right font. And this is a Daniel Steele. Another very simple book cover. This is simply black and white. There is some text going on here. The outline, the silhouette of a bird, very striking. It's also very clearly a thriller, probably a horror thriller. And a very simple use of color. We've got black, we've got white, we've got red. And that negative space speaks volumes. That negative space is very empty and ominous, and that works really well in the genre. And bam, Neal Stephenson, he's a pretty popular author. He's pretty successful, and this is his book cover. Very simple, very easy, very DIY-able. If you pay attention to the basic fundamentals of what we're talking about here, you execute them well, you're going to have something that's going to be far more effective than any sort of fancy schmancy thing you can come up with that will not work as well for you. This is about as simple as it gets, and it still communicates everything the book needs it to communicate within that half second. So here's another book cover. I've covered up the font, and we still already pretty much know what this is. This is a fairy tale. Now this image was probably drawn for the cover, but it's a single image. There's a lot of empty space. There's the road, there's the field, but it communicates the setting very clearly. This is also a much older book cover, so the fonts, they're not going to be up to modern standards simply because they haven't evolved in the industry yet. But this does communicate the setting very, very clearly. This is going to be a medieval fairy tale. And guess what? Now, how much better is this book cover to the original book cover? I mean, at least with this one, we know the setting. We got that right. at least with the later book cover, we know it's a fairy tale. We know it's in medieval. But oh, I mean, that's the difference right there. That's the difference between a book cover that executes the fundamentals well and a book cover that just doesn't. So for whatever reason, I can't get my screenshot video software to work this week. So I've grabbed a couple of book covers to show you from different genres, and I'm just going to go through and show you some of the things that I'm noticing. So these are all adult fantasy, and what we're looking at here, we're looking at the imagery and we're looking at the font. So the fonts that I'm seeing here for adult fantasy are bold. They're usually all capitals. We have a lot of sharp angles, a lot of sharp edges, and there's some sort of flair in that font. So you get these little swirls and things, just a little bit of flair, something that just sort of softens it and gives it a bit of a fantasy feel there. Another thing I'm seeing with adult fantasy is there's not a lot of people, or if they are, it's, you know, guy with sword. Guy with sword is good, but there's imagery of, there's sort of this epic imagery. There's a large space being shown. There's a castle in the background. There's just a symbol or an image or an item that's being shown on the cover versus a person or a face. We're going to contrast this real quick with some selections from young adult fantasy, where pretty much always you've got a person on the cover. There's someone there. You get the same sort of font, okay, but which is to say there are a lot of sharp angles, there are a lot of sharp lines, but there's still some of that scripty sort of fancy element to it. That's pretty much going to be your industry standard for young adult fantasy. So let's look at some thrillers. Thrillers have a very set font that they use. It's very bold, it's very large, and it is very solid. It's a no-nonsense sort of font. It's bold, it's big, and you got these sharp lines. There's very little deviation really in the fonts used in adult thrillers. You're looking at really a very masculine font. It's for thrillers. I'm seeing a lot of blue and orange. That seems to be, and also yellow. We have some very, very clearly minimized color spectrums being used here. So, I mean, maybe 3 colors at most, often just 2, blue and yellow, blue and red. There's a lot of blue. And it's still very, I mean, that's a striking cover right there. And it very clearly puts the setting in mind. So this is a contemporary, this is this gives the impression of a political thriller. For this, The New Girl. And, you know, let me click and, yeah, Chief of Israeli Intelligence. It's a political thriller. So that, you know, bang on, that communicated exactly what it needed to communicate. This is a book where if you plan it out well, you know, this is a single image and it's just a high resolution. If you plan it out well, you can get away with a DIY book cover that still fits within your genre standard if you're writing an adult thriller. Science fiction. Science fiction is another genre that has a very distinct font. It's based on the font that was originally used by some of the first computers so that computers could see the difference clearly in each letter. It's not really designed for people, but it has a very specific and identifiable look to it. And the fonts you see on modern science fictions are going to be fonts that have evolved from the original computer standard. Also, science fiction, you get a lot of, obviously, spaceships. And you know what? A spaceship does a really good job of putting in mind the setting of your story. Now, romance has its own little language of fonts. So if we're looking at historical romance, you get some very, very scripty, flowy, fancy fonts. And the more sort of Victorian that you have, the more scripty and fancy these fonts are. And this is a very clear standard of the genre for historical romance. It's going to be this super scripty font, and you're probably going to have a couple kissing and, you know, this big dress, which very clearly establishes the era and the setting that, you know, the story is in. So good job there. But these covers work, and for very good reason. The reader who is scrolling through these many options is going to see that cover and immediately recognize it as the sort of book they're looking for if they're looking for historical romance. Now, romance as a genre really started out as this sort of harlequin thing, this historical romance, arranged marriage thing, and further stories have evolved from this. So if we look into contemporary romance, you can see the evolution of that. So when you're dealing with a contemporary romance, you're almost always going to get a mixture of this very scripty font and a bolder, almost like a thriller type font. And that's going to be a standard for contemporary romance, is this combination of fancy script and more bold thriller type fonts. So even when you've just got one word in the title, there's still going to be that combination of flowy fancy script and then bold. That is a clear standard of this genre. So we've looked at some good covers, we've looked at some bad covers, we've talked about the difference, and hopefully by now you have a pretty clear idea of where to go to better develop what sort of cover you need for your book. Some other just quick tips that I often see self-published authors making mistakes on. There is a belief that your title and your name and any wording on your book cover needs to be clearly legible at thumbnail size. This is not true. If you just scroll through Amazon, the title is going to be right by the side of the cover, and that's where most people read. It's not at all necessary, and in fact it kind of looks self-published if your title is like that. Now, we talked about thrillers. Thrillers tend to have very big, bold fonts, and as a consequence of this, they tend to be legible at thumbnail size, but that's also genre standard. Especially in fantasies, YA fantasies, you want a font that almost blends into the cover. That was one thing I specifically had to work on with my cover designer, was making sure the font blended in with the image. I wanted it to disappear a little bit, because that's kind of a standard of the YA fantasy genre, is to have these very fancy scripts that blend in, and just a heavily worked image. Just a lot of work going into the graphics design of these book covers. Another tip is that if you've won any awards for your book or something, they give you these little stickers that you can put on the cover. Do yourself a favor, don't put that sticker on there. It's probably just going to clash with the overall imagery of your book, and it's highly unlikely to sell anyone. At this stage, at the second stage in your book marketing, the first stage is keywords, the second stage is book covers. The book cover isn't there to sell your book. The book cover is there to get the reader to your book description, okay? Sort of external validation and references to your book, including awards, That's all going to be in the reviews step. That's going to be step 4. So if you have awards, don't bother putting them on the cover. It's just going to mess up your cover. We'll talk about where to put it when we get into, the next video. And the last thing I want to talk about is how to work with a professional book cover designer. Now, for The Last Dragon Princess, I did work with a book cover designer, and one thing you need to be aware of is that most book cover designers aren't actually book cover designers. They're graphics designers who have a side gig or who have gone off on their own and are making money doing book covers, which is a great way to use your graphic design skills because there's a lot of self-published authors out there buying book covers. However, the skills, the training, the experience that most graphic designers have aren't necessarily one-to-one applicable to book cover psychology. These are very talented artists who can make some beautiful images and do some wonderful things with stock photo manipulation. But that doesn't mean they know how to communicate in that half second what that book needs to communicate. So you're in charge of this business. You're the one hiring the book cover designer. You need to be able to communicate what you need this image to do to your book cover designer, which means you still need to do the research on what the standards of your genre are. A book cover designer is going to be able to make you a beautiful image, but they may not know anything about how much negative space is standard for your genre, or have any clue on what sort of fonts are going to be appropriate. These are things that are very commonly missed, and they can turn what is a very beautiful book cover into a very bad book cover simply because it's not giving the right information in that half second that you needed to give that information in. So if you've written an adult thriller and you have hired a book cover designer, you need to communicate very clearly, hey, I'm looking for, a minimal color palette utilizing a lot of blues and oranges. I need some very bold, masculine fonts that have a lot of straight lines and very little frill. This is the sort of thing you need to communicate. So that's all from me today. I hope you have found this video useful. Please talk to me in the comments if you have any questions or anything that I can help you out with. I'm always looking forward to hearing from you. Next video we are talking about book blurbs. So I will see you next time. And until then, bye-bye. Now you don't want to do this. Your book is unique. You want a cover just as unique as your book. You're wrong. Can I record now? You ever heard the phrase, kill your darlings? The more emotionally invested you are in your cover, the worse it probably is. Okay, so my screenshot recorder, or my screen video recorder is not working, so yay. I'm gonna have to work around that. It's probably gonna clash, and also, no one cares. And I think that's it. Yeah, that's it.